So I definitely want to welcome you all to the first dialogue, which is titled Researching History. I have a really pleasure to introduce you to these two speakers here, researchers, historians with whom we will have this dialogue and discussion today. So I shortly present them. So Simon Dixon, Professor Simon Dixon, first worked in the Slavonic Library in 1985 and has been a regular visitor ever since. He currently teaches Russian history at the University College London, UCL. And the other one is Anton Kotenko. He's a research fellow at the Chair of Eastern European History of the University of Düsseldorf. And I give them a possibility to tell more about their own research and what you have done. So how we go on. Yes, of course. I'm Sari Autio-Sarasmo. I'm a moderator of this discussion. So I'm a historian myself. I'm specialized on Soviet history and especially about Cold War history. So that's my background. So we will proceed so that first we will give these the speakers a possibility to tell about their own research and what is actually their connection to Slavonic Library. And after that, so we will have a dialogue. And after the dialogue, hopefully we have time, as Irma mentioned, we have time for questions from the audience. So maybe we'll start from Simon. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Does this sound about right to you? Good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I must admit, when I first came into this marvelous room and gazed up at the dome, I never really imagined I'd be speaking to you at an event like this. It didn't cross my mind. At that stage, of course, many of you remember this, I think this was a catalogue hall still then. So there were lots of those wonderful little wooden drawers that some of us remember and still miss. So it was quite a moment coming in here then. I don't think this rather clever lighting was here then either, so it was much darker. My first memory was of quite a gloomy but powerful sort of room. So it's a great pleasure to be here again, and of course it's an honor. And although everything that I'll say after this will be purely personal, I have to begin by saying that I think here really I'm representing quite a considerable group of friends and colleagues of many generations, even older than me, who've been coming here for years, still come here, and hope to come here again in the future. The title of the symposium was very well chosen, I think, because it is a very special place to a lot of us. And it's a special place not only because of the books that we find here, but because of the people we find here, our own colleagues whom we meet, but also, perhaps especially really, the staff of the library, who have been quite marvellous in their help to me and to dozens of other scholars from North America, from East Asia, and from all parts of Europe. So we're all very, very much in your debt. Now, as Sari said, I did first come here in 1985. That's to say, I didn't come here at all because at that stage, the library, as you'll remember, was down the road by the seaside in Polku, in the theology faculty, or with the theology faculty, and a very good cafeteria. I shan't tell you which I visited more often. And it was, for me, a quite marvellous experience, because at that stage I was working, thanks to a very generous Finnish government scholarship, I was working on the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. And not a lot of people did that then. When I began, Mr. Chernenko was in charge of the Kremlin, and the Russian Orthodox Church was not an institution that seemed to have a glorious future. So I was thought very odd, not only for that reason, of course, but I did it, and I revelled in what I discovered here, because at that stage, sources on that subject were very, very little known. Nobody really wrote about that kind of thing. And nobody realized, I think, the sheer vast range of material that was available on this subject. I was working on the late 19th, early 20th century, and in particular on the Diocese of St. Petersburg, which until 1892, of course, included Finland. So that really was quite a remarkable experience to come here, suddenly discover all these marvelous journals all sitting there on the open shelves, which I'd never been able to see before. And I felt I'd spent my first 2 years, as it were, describing the circumference of a black hole. I'd been working away in London, and I had all this sort of peripheral information, and I had no idea whether a subject really existed inside it. And here I came, and there it was. And so ever since then, I've felt that this was a place of tremendous discovery and reassurance. And it continues to be that. So that was my first experience. I came back several times to work on that sort of subject, including, of course, across the road in the National Archive. It was a very fruitful period for me. Then that subject became more fashionable, and as it became more fashionable, I became less interested in it. So I moved away to do something else. I've always tried to do something a bit different. And the first thing wasn't so different, and that was to work on the 18th century. I spent quite a long time on the 18th century. And my second experience that I'll tell you about here was to write about the history of the court in the 18th century. Again, not a subject which has attracted a lot of attention, remarkably. I mean, almost everything else has been written about, but not until very recently, the court. And there are good reasons for that, because the material is very complicated. There are lots of lists, basically. But I wanted to work on the court calendar. And sure enough, of course, you have it, I think uniquely, again, on the open shelves. So whereas we have it in London up to 1773, after which it gets a lot bigger, Harvard, I think, has the whole lot, but it's all kept in store. Here it's like the Orthodox periodicals on the open shelves. And I think that's the one thing that I initially valued above all else in coming here, to have this extraordinary variety of material, just like that in front of you. You can sort of move backwards and forwards, check things again. You're not limited to 6 documents a day. You can have everything in the same room rather than in special collections, rare books, periodicals, all those kinds. Everything here is made easy for a researcher. And as a result, of course, one gets through a vast amount more in a shorter time. It's a tremendously efficient place to work. So although I'm sadly now not usually able to come for 2 or 3 months, I can only come for 1 or 2 weeks, I can still get this vast amount of work done here in a way which is quite impossible anywhere else. So that was the second thing. I then wanted, thirdly, to write a book about Britain and Russia and the Eastern Patriarchates, and I did, so in other words, really a book about the Holy Land and Syria. And I did a lot of work on that in British sources and in Russian printed sources. And then, because of the pandemic and later circumstances, I wasn't able to do the Russian archival part of it. So that will have to wait a bit. So instead, I've turned to writing a completely different sort of book, really, which again is a bit curious. And that is a history of the horse in Russia since 1600. So a long sort of period. There are a lot of horses in Russia, especially since 1600. So mercifully, I don't have to meet all of them, or even count them, though fortunately someone else did that. So there's some interesting material to work for. Now, someone might say, well, why on earth should somebody who's interested in the church be interested in the horse? What on earth have they got in common? Well, you'd be surprised what they have in common. In the first place, they're both, in some ways, introverted institutions. So in other words, you can write about the church from the point of view of its own interrelationship, and you can write about the horse industry from its own introverted sort of set of relationships. Anybody who knows anything about horse racing, for example, will know just what an inward-looking world that is in any country. But on the other hand, of course, the horse, particularly in Russia, certainly until the 1950s, was involved in almost every aspect of the Russian society, economy, civilian, military, whichever way you look at it. The horse is everywhere, rather like the church had been everywhere beforehand. So this is the sort of subject I like. It's the sort of subject which connects, and makes connections with things. And it's here that I think I've found the real marvel of your library, because here, of course, you have not only sort of well-known historical journals that we've all used for many years, but all sorts of weird and wonderful veterinary materials, for example, extremely important for anything to do with the history of animals. You've got lots of stuff on the history of the animals themselves, and the Breeders' Journal, for example. You're the only library to have any serious run of that outside Russian Federation. So there's a vast amount of material that you can just interrelate and check up on simultaneously, flitting from one source to another in a very short time. And to me, over the past 2 or 3 years, that has been a marvelous achievement, facility, really. So those are the 3 things that I've been doing here, superficially rather different. Well, they are different, all done under quite different sort of political circumstances, both in Russia and at home in many ways. And I think I'm going to stop now, but to use the rest of the time when we talk a little bit more to explain some of the things that I think matter about the relationship between the past and the present in the way that an historian thinks. Because, of course, historians do change their minds. They change the questions they ask a little bit according to the circumstances of the present in which they live. There's bound to be a dialogue between past and present. Otherwise, there would be no interest in the history, really. It would just become mere antiquarianism. So there has to be some connection with the present. The question is really, how strong should that link be? How far should what you do be dictated by present circumstances? And there, of course, there's room for a serious discussion, and I'm sure that's what we're going to have. But for the moment, I'll stop there, and thank you very much indeed for your invitation.
Well, on my side, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Team Slavica for inviting me here today. It's an immense honor to take part in your celebration. And Mnogo Elita, congratulations. The library has been important for me since my first visit here around 2010, 2011, when I came here as a PhD student from Budapest. And I was working on the subject of creation of Ukrainian national space. Therefore, materials that I was back then primarily interested in here, they were maps. And it was in Slavica that I, for the first time, encountered one of the main heroes of my dissertation and now book manuscript, which is ethnographic map of Slavs by Pavel Josef Shafazik of 1842. A map which became a blueprint for construction of many national territories in the region of Eastern and Central Europe. In addition to this particular map, which is kept in the map collection here, I was also able to find many more maps which were published and included into small books, but most importantly into periodicals, maps which are usually not listed in any map catalogs because historians of cartography don't really study some journals and they don't even know that those maps were included into those journals. So this is why I think that as a result of my year in Slavica, my dissertation and hopefully the book will become the first ever study of all ethnographic cartography of Ukraine that we have at the moment. And this, I guess, was the main challenge of me to work with this subject, because as most of you know, we as historians, most of the time we don't have any choice but to study a subject about which we know that some sources for sure exist. And then there is this question of how do you study something that you don't know if you will find sources about this subject. You don't know if any evidence about this subject actually is in the library or archival collections. So it's next to impossible to study such a topic. And in my case, this was precisely what happened. Whenever I had to fill in this questionnaire, that usually we have to fill in when we come to an archive or a library, and which asks you a topic of your research. And I would write Ukrainian national space, 19th century, and then I will, of course, be asked, so which materials would you like to use? And then I will have to explain pretty hard why do I have to study maps and landscape painting and theater and censorship and language, dictionaries, and so on. So that was the main problem to me, how to pin down this this topic in my sources. Today, unfortunately, there are many scholars around who are interested in Ukrainian borders, in the history of Ukrainian borders. But when I was doing it in 2010, 2011, it was still quite new. And this is why I was incredibly lucky and privileged indeed to spend a year in Slavica, because many of the sources I needed, starting from Shafarek's map of 1842 and finishing with Mikhailo Hrushevsky's 1913 history of Ukraine, they were available to me here. And during that year, my first year in Slavica, I was also incredibly privileged and actually lucky, because my stay here coincided with the summer school organized by the university, summer school in conceptual history. Again, this was something new to even professors of the summer school, because history of geographical concepts is not that much widespread. Historians, conceptual historians, they only recently started to explore history of such seemingly objective geographical concepts as, say, South America and so on. So only 1 year ago, when I was finishing, in a way, this long project, and I was turning my dissertation finally into a book manuscript, I realized that, in fact, what I was doing through all of these years was not just a study of Ukrainian national space, but actually a study of a concept of Ukraine. So therefore, in my case, my stay in Slavica, together with participation in this summer school on conceptual history, brought me in the end to the project that hopefully will be published quite soon.
Okay. Thank you. These were the presentations by our researchers, so they are about their personal experiences, and I think it's now the time to turn to this dialogue. And I just want to add here, because both explained to us that how important place Slavonic Library is for all of us. And it's easy to say that I definitely agree with that. And I have to say from my own experience this a little bit, that since I'm teaching, I'm a teacher as well. And I just came straight from the summer school, different summer school, not conceptual history, but the summer school for Russian and Eastern European studies. And it was actually yesterday when I recommend one MA student who was actually participating that if you want to study this, you definitely should go to Slavonic Library. And also that say, and it wasn't actually me who suggested that, go to Slavonic Library and ask the staff. They are happy to help you, and they are really nice people. So I think this is a good starting point for this kind of discussion. So obviously there are many important issues which we definitely, and I hope we can discuss during this dialogue. But let's say this warming up a little bit for this discussion, I would start to go slightly to the direction of what is the future of the field and what is the future of area studies, for example. But it would be nice to know first, or hear your comments, how actually the research conditions have changed during the years, and what kind of challenges you have experienced during your career. You have 2 different careers here. It would be really nice to hear about this. So if you, Simon, if you'd start.
Yes, well, they have changed quite a bit. One thing that hasn't changed is here, of course, in a way. That is the great attraction of the continuity of provision of remarkable services here. But in every other respect, things have changed. When I began, as I said, in the early 1980s, it was possible for us, from Britain, to have a year in what was then the Soviet Union, working in archives and in libraries. I had no difficulty in working in their libraries. Archives were a bit more complicated. I wasn't able to see everything that I wanted to. I had to wait quite a long time. So I lost a lot of time out of that. But it was certainly possible, and it remained possible all the way through the Soviet period to have academic exchanges. Then, of course, after 1991, working in Russia became in some ways much more straightforward. The archives opened up, and there was much easier archival access, which then gradually began to get a little bit more difficult, especially in regional archives. I last worked in the Urals, in the archive in Yekaterinburg in 2019, almost immediately before the pandemic, right at the end of the year. And I was certainly the only foreign person working there then. And then, of course, since then, in the circumstances of the war, things have become much more awkward. And now it's not really, though it's possible in principle for us to go, it's not so easy. So 2019 was the last time I went to Russia. I haven't worked in archives since then. So the question really is then, well, what do you do if archives are not so easily available? And I think that's actually a much bigger problem for 20th century Soviet historians and for those who are following them than it is for those of us who are interested in the 19th century. Because one of the things that I would certainly want to emphasize is that there is far more material than anybody, I think, ever realized, published material, of a perfectly serviceable sort for the historian, available on the period, particularly the period, let's say, 1830 to 1930. There's a vast amount of published material on a very wide range of subjects, which most of us haven't yet really touched. Because I think one feature of work on Russian and Eastern European subjects has been it's tended to follow some fairly narrow channels, vast amounts of work on one or two relatively small subjects, and it's only, well, big subjects, but narrowly defined, usually defined by, as it were, present-day needs. So in the case of the 1980s, everybody was still working on the revolution and things about the revolution, consequences of the revolution. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Should it have happened? Could it have happened? All these things. But there wasn't the wide range of social and cultural history that we're now seeing as possible, and I think is possible in the pre-revolutionary period for Russian history even now. The difficulty is, of course, that now very few people actually work on these sort of subjects in Western universities, particularly in North America, I think. The 20th century and the 21st century now really dominate most appointments. And that's a great pity because they don't actually dominate student interest. If you put on courses for the earlier period, certainly I've always found, there's a very high student interest in Russian history of the earlier period. So those are my broad sort of thoughts, that of course things have changed. What has changed above all is archival access, which has fluctuated, I think, rather than gone in a straight line. But that actually creates a great role for the library, it seems to me, in the future, or at least for the foreseeable future, when access to archives is limited.
Speaking about changes of research conditions, yes, I will only echo Simon and say that luckily not everything changed, and I do know that if I would like to still peruse my favorite Ukrainian language journal of the late 19th century, Ukrainska Khata, it's still on the shelf in Slavica and I can always find it there. But yesterday, I was just working on footnotes of my manuscript, of my book manuscript, on the concept of modern Ukraine. And again, I realized that actually many things changed since 2010s. when I was writing my dissertation. And back then, I literally had to, and my intention, my striving was to read all Ukrainian media of the time. And back then, I literally had to locate all of these newspapers and journals in hard copies and read them as hard copies. Now, I wanted to double check some footnotes, and I could easily go to the website of Ukrainian National Library, and this newspaper is available online, so it's twice, not even twice, it's much easier now to track necessary pages than it was 10 years ago. So most obviously, I would say that digitization slowly enters Eastern European studies and changes our field. It's not yet as good as in the field of, let's say, Finnish history. We don't have newspapers that I mentioned. They are digitized, but they are not OCR'd, so it's not possible to search for some keywords there, but at least there are these images available to us on screens. And most recently, of course, this is an elephant that all of us are aware of, but nevertheless, as far as I'm also entering animal studies, I guess it's good to mention elephants. So unfortunately, the major change that all of us face at the moment is the war. And I guess most likely it also started to affect Slavica as well. And what I mean is that irrespectively of what our institutions tell us, we as scholars, as citizens, human beings, all of us face this question of how to deal with the lack of sources, archival and library sources in Russia. They are not available to many of us who choose to take an ethical stance, not to even think of ways to find access to those materials. And those of us who think that at the moment it's not even ethically possible to conduct any research in Russian Federation, they have to think of alternative ways to find sources for our studies, and hence places like Slavica, which is a unique place, not in the region but in the world actually. They will, if not already are, being turned into the main source for our studies for all historians of the Romanov Empire or the Soviet Union in the world.
Thank you. I think that this is a good way to continue this discussion in this sense that we all know that there is no access if we think about these area studies, especially those who are studying Russia. So we don't have an access to Russia, at least not in Finland. So we are, as researchers, we are not allowed to travel. Of course, as a person, just individuals, we are of course able to travel, but as researchers, and we know that there are changes also in Russia doing research, and meaning that there is no access to, as you both mentioned, that there's no access to archives, for example, there's no access to archival materials, not even those that are digitized, so it's difficult to get sort of an online access of these. And so this has, of course, changed a lot, and I have followed this change as a teacher, also supervising PhD researchers, and of course 2 years ago when Russian aggression invasion to Ukraine took place, so it was of course a situation when there were not necessarily hundreds of young researchers who just come across that, what should I do? How should I change my topic? What can I do? Because I don't have an access to these materials anymore. And obviously it's about the same situation in a like in Ukraine, that you can't use the Ukrainian archives because that's a place, there's a war going on. So it was a big change in thinking that what to do next and what is actually going to happen in the future. And this of course applies to these materials we can use. And so I think that there's a lot of this discussion that which direction are we able to do research anymore in the future in area studies in this field. And I do remember 2 years ago, I was in a summer school commenting papers, and then there was something that we don't know what's going to happen. Last year, the situation was something like, okay, we survive in a way as researchers. We are able to direct our research a little bit. And I think that this year's summer school, I can see some kind of positive tones in this sense that we are doing this research, we can continue doing research, and actually we think we have an important position as researchers to do this research, to tell what's going on. And so this was really something that we have to rethink what kind of materials we are able to use. And since you are both historians, and you, like Simon, you mentioned that you have this possibility that actually you can find still all the materials here. But what is actually, if you think your research and also your possible future research topics, so how you see the future from the point of view of research materials? So what do you think, or do you think that there is a lot of material about horses in Russian Empire?
Well, there are several questions there, aren't there?
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, in the first place, of course, historians, if they're good at anything, they're not usually very good at predicting the future. All right? That's one thing where, over time, they have proved pretty bad, time and time again. So you mustn't take any notice of anything I say about the future. Mine is, in any case, short. I think the way that I would look at it is this, that it's not just a matter of horses, all sorts of subjects about which we've been looking, say, for the last generation or so. The emphasis has all been on breaking down national barriers, hasn't it, really? It's all been about seeing connections across borders in all sorts of ways, be they geological and environmental at the sort of fundamental physical level. There's a marvelous conference going on now in Oulu, up in the north, of environmental historians. That's big business now. And there's a whole range of cultural contexts across borders. My case, for example, I just give you the horses as an example. Essentially, the Russians' question was whether or not to breed from English horses, which they did until around about 1870, or whether or not to breed from American horses, which they did from about 1870 onwards. And so, not surprisingly, there's quite a lot of information about all this in both British and American sources as well, leading across. So these are what it's fashionable to call transnational types of topic. And I think this is the way that, well, at least one way, I'm certainly not here to tell people how to choose their topics, but it's one way to think, that not to imagine that everything about our area must be found in our area. It can be found all over the place and connected to our area. And in that way, we expand the nature of what we're writing about. And that seems to me to be a good idea, because I think there's been a worry that our Russian and East European studies have become a kind of silo, which was of course, defensible in a way during the Cold War period, because then Russia and Eastern Europe were an area, as it were. They were a geopolitical area, perhaps for the first and only time in history, that was clearly definable. It's not so obvious now that that's true. And I think the more we can do to make connections with other places, the better it will be for us, better it'll be for our Russian history, and the better it'll be for scholarship in general.
I can only echo Simon and many other colleagues around the world who, for the last 2 years, have spoken a lot about decentering previous narratives of Eastern European history. And despite the fact that these conversations have taken place and have been going on for, I guess, 100 years at least, not much progress has been made in this field so far. For example, only 2 days ago, I decided to use this occasion of coming to this symposium and actually read the history of libraries. So I picked up a recent book written by published by 2 professors at St. Andrews in 2021. And as I was reading the book, actually it made me quite annoyed that whenever they were talking about Eastern Europe, they were always calling the space Russia. So Eastern Europe is Russia, full stop for them. And it's 2021, unfortunately. So I'm very, very happy that today more and more scholars scholars who are in very early stages of their careers, they actively argue against this kind of scholarship written by their older mentors who were brought up in this kind of St. Petersburg, Moscow centered Bildung. These younger scholars, they increasingly learn other regional languages, not just Russian, besides Russian, and they pursue research, more and more research in various so-called peripheries of the former Romanov Empire. Again, I'm doing 19th century, so I'm not talking about Soviet Union. Former peripheries of the Romanov Empire. And the point of this development is, of course, not to deny our need to study Russian or Russian language or Russia, but to pay attention to other people and other places who hitherto have been categorized as Russian. And this gives me hope that our histories in the future will finally bid farewell to the supremacy of Russia and Russian as the only object of study, and will bring us to the fuller recognition that both Romanov Empire and Soviet Union, they were not Russian, even though, of course, the Russian culture was a dominant one. But having said that, I've been studying history of Ukraine for quite some time, even though not much time, but nevertheless. And yes, of course, I'm very happy that many historians from the US and from the UK, they are increasingly entering the field as well. But to be honest, whenever I read discussions of what this centralization, decolonization of Eastern European history is, I often found it quite sterile in terms of concrete suggestions of how to write new history of the area. And very recently, a month ago, actually, I even tried to share some of my ideas of this development. I co-authored a paper with my colleague from the University of Tartu, Catherine Gibson, which we called Imperial Threads. And in this paper, we are arguing that usually scholars have conceived of empires as these vertical structures, which are very much concentrated on centers of the empire and of relations of those centers with particular peripheries. So let's say scholars will study connections which would link St. Petersburg and Warsaw, St. Petersburg and Kyiv, St. Petersburg and Tashkent, and so on. One attempt to break out of this paradigm, and Simon mentioned it, was to pay attention to transnational connections and to stories which would be British, Romanov, Habsburg, Romanov, cross-border relations, and so on. Lots of such discussion taking place in my new project on history of zoological gardens. But nevertheless, what we wrote about in this paper was a suggestion of looking to another type of connection, and a connection between actually peripheries. So again, not studying, not writing the story of St. Petersburg, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Tashkent, but pay attention to connections between Tashkent and Warsaw and Kyiv and Helsinki and so on and so forth. So instead of this radial structure very much built on power, with rays coming from St. Petersburg, metaphorically speaking, as if one stands somewhere next to Admiralty with Nevsky Prospect and Gorokhovo and Voznесensky leading out of the capital, we suggested to use this metaphor of a web, which is also already for some time discussed by the historians of the British Empire, actually, and look into the connections between various peripheries. And it seems to us that that's the way our scholarship will be moving more and more in the coming years.
Thank you. That is interesting. It's very nice to hear about that we are going back to peripheries, because I think that I did my own PhD more than 22 years ago about periphery. So nice to see that that's complete. So that was actually based on the fact that in 1990s all the archives were open in Russia, and then you can go there, and I was studying Soviet Karelia, and that was a kind of periphery thing, and then now we are going back to this. There was a really interesting point you were mentioning, and I think that part of this going to peripheries is, as you both mentioned, that actually that it's a lack of materials, that what they can use actually, those who are researching this area today, and especially those who are studying Russia or the Soviet Union, historians obviously, or Russian Empire. So I think that because as a teacher, so I just had a discussion with MA student who wanted to study the Soviet Union. And she can't go to Russia to do the research in Russian archives. So she decided to go to Kazakhstan, because there she can go to archives, she can use the materials and do that. But obviously the idea is not to study the Soviet Union using Kazakh material, but actually it's to study Kazakhstan as a periphery of the Soviet Union. And this is also that I definitely think that you are right when you are doing this kind of research, and it applies also to the Soviet time, Soviet period as well. And then we come to this actually discussion about languages. And I think that this is the question that, of course, you go to archives, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, wherever, or these very, I don't think that people in Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan like that we are calling them periphery at the moment, but of course they are independent states in this sense. But the point is that it's easy to find material which is written in Russian. But when you're studying periphery, I think that is also that you should know the language, as it discussed, of course, among researchers in Finland, how you can study Russia if you don't Russian language. And I think that this is one of the major questions and things at the moment, that we should support learning languages. Although that most of my colleagues, including myself, so we are publishing in English. And a little bit also in Finnish. And of course we should publish more in our own language. But so this is the situation, and it seems to change also. But I would like to take the discussion a little bit back to the Slavonic Library, because as we all know who are using Slavonic Library, there are different languages, material from different areas of Russian Empire, the Soviet, and also the post-Soviet space. And so then the question of this rich amount of, or the variety of different materials. So now we come to this current situation about the digitalization. And I know that in Slavonic Library there's a lot of digitized materials and also so-called e-materials from different places. So what is your attitude towards these digitized materials or e-materials? Do you use them?
Oh yes, I can turn on the machine. Can I just say something before I get to that, Sari? Would it be all right just to carry on that business about decentering just for a minute? Because I'm sure you're right that if we're going to take that seriously, languages are going to be required. And it is actually quite difficult for most people to do it. It's easy to say and to talk about seeing things from the Kazakh point of view, but actually in order to do that, you need a linguistic capacity far beyond what most of us can manage, certainly beyond what I can manage. And so I think that it won't be an immediate thing. And I think, thinking about that, I'd say something more general. One's attitude to life in general, and perhaps scholarship in particular. There are two sort of views, aren't there? You can have you can have either or in your approach to scholarship, or you can have not only but also. And I rather always want to argue for the not only but also point of view. So it seems to me that these new approaches, based partly on views of Russia, based partly on availability of material, are absolutely marvellous and very much, to be welcomed, but they don't completely overthrow what was there before. And I think there will still be a very strong argument for historians to think about Russia, to think about where decisions were made in Russia, how decisions were made in Russia, sometimes at a quite high political level. So all sorts of really rather old-fashioned sort of approaches to history are perhaps, if anything, even more necessary now than they were a few years ago. So that's all I wanted to say. I think I'm absolutely in favour of all sorts of new ways of looking things, always am. But I don't think we should imagine that all the old questions have been answered simply because we're looking at new ways of doing it. Now then, electronic materials. Yes, of course, I mean, this has transformed things, hasn't it, really? I mean, one thing, just to give an example, the Zemstva materials. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to look at those, but in the old days, they were frightening because, there are walls of these things, sort of covered with impossible statistics of everything, really, that you could think of. And nobody really wrote sensibly about them except Vysilovsky, who managed to somehow do the whole lot in about 5 years at the beginning of the 20th century. How he did it, I don't know. He must have been a magician. Everybody else who tried got lost. But now those materials are searchable through Russian library websites, and it's transformed what you can do with them. You can get a long way with them. So in all sorts of ways, I think electronic methods, not only in our field, but of course in every field, have transformed historians' ways of working. One of my best friends is a very distinguished historian of medieval music. And he said, to me the other day, I could never have written this book about the mandolin if I hadn't been able to write mandolin and get every medieval manuscript, from here to Siena. So of course it's crucial. I don't think, however, it's likely that everything in every library will be digitized. There will be material, little pamphlets, bits of series, things which are thought not so important or to everybody, not so widely used. These will not be available digitally. And it would be a pity, it seems to me, if we as scholars simply forgot about these or decided not to use them. You will all have students, I imagine, I certainly have students, who don't believe anything exists unless it's on their little electronic websites. My students are excellent. They're really clever. I like them very much. We have a lot of fun. But even the best ones will come up to me and say, yours is a rather unusual course. We go to the library. I said, oh, is that a maiden voyage, is it? Yes. I said, right, you tried the sort of big green one at the end of the... Yes, And this seems to me to be, well, of course, in one way it is funny. It's sort of symptomatic that a whole sort of range of materials is gradually slipping out of sight. And that, it seems to me, would be, as it were, the tragedy of digitalization.
Well, I can only echo again Simon here and say that his idea of, but also is applicable also to our sources that we use. And often when you read about digitization, it's either or, it's either we all go digital and all the libraries are closed, or we just use hard copies. And I think that in my current research, both are actually complementing each other. So it's good to have both digital and hard copies of books and journals at our disposal. This question is very much also nuanced when you talk about a strange kind of sources, let's say, and my strange kind of source would be maps. Even though there are dozens of websites which offer you digitized scanned maps of the 19th century, in my experience, it's just impossible to see maps properly and to analyze map properly in front of you on the screen, if it's even if it's a 27 inches wide screen. My best example that I have are ethnographic maps of the Russian Empire, of the Romanov Empire of the mid-19th century, which are simply enormous in their size. And it's, again, impossible completely to analyze them in a proper way when you don't know that when you can't imagine this sheer size of that map, which you can't when you see it on the screen. You can only imagine it when it lies in front of you on a desk. And this is why I was very happy last year. I was given a class here at the University of Helsinki on spatial history, and we had one seminar on maps, and we were lucky and that the library colleagues allowed us to visit the library with students, and actually they prepared a couple of these maps for us to take a look at, and it created completely different impression upon the students in comparison to what they saw just an evening before in front of them on screens.
Yeah, maybe it's because we are historians that we like these hard copies. We like to go to library, and I really love this place because you can. Sometimes I'm thinking that I would like to bring my students here to say that this is history, as such, and all this, the information, the knowledge, what is actually here in the library. So it's something really amazing. And it was really a surprise to me. I'm a bit older, obviously, than my students, but it was the first time when I saw that they are reading articles from phones, and I was thinking, how is this possible? But it seems to be so that it's easy. Maybe that's something that we need to learn to do in the future. But luckily we have libraries. And actually I have two more questions. I would like to hear what you think, but it's mainly about libraries. But I actually, before we go to libraries and the future of libraries, I would like to ask you the question that I know that, Simon, you said that historians should not discuss about the future as such, but I think that the role of historians is extremely important today, but also for the future. And I just had yesterday interesting discussion in the summer school because there were political scientists, and there was a question that what has happened because the political science has become so political nowadays. And I was thinking, obviously, of this area and the current situation. So I was thinking that what is the role of historians now, in the sense that we are studying this area, whether it's transnational history or entangled histories, whatever we are studying. So are we able to avoid of being political?
No, I don't suppose any historian has ever been able to write in some sort of vacuum. I mean, it doesn't work, does it? What one seeks to do, or at least I've always hoped to try to do, is to try to understand how people in the past might have thought differently from us. How to explain what they did, even if what they did seems to us to be a rather odd thing to have chosen to do. Now, the question then becomes whether you judge people in the past for acting differently. And that has become, I think, more popular amongst historians in recent decades, or perhaps in very recent years. It's now possible to stand in judgment over past generations for things that they did. And then, the present now apologizes for things that happened in the past, which has always struck me as a very curious thing to do, in that we have no responsibility for what other people did in the past. So I belong to the sort of group of people who would argue that it's very important to try to work out how people in the past have thought, but not necessarily to judge them for it. I mean, perfectly clearly, some things that happened in the past were reprehensible from everybody's point of view. Obviously they were, but we're not to sit in judges on the past, it seems to me, because we're not saints ourselves.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess there are two sides to this question about historians and their role in the societies. First of all, Yes, I would rather say that the events of the last 3 years, they show that history is extremely important by the way that the authoritarian governments around the world attack history and use historical knowledge in the past to manipulate the present. So therefore historians who can actually engage with these manipulations act or can perform important political roles. But also, on the second point that one might be able to make is that is related to this old, thousands years old idea of historia as magistra vitae. So, how much lessons of the past can be deducted to be used in the future? And again, I think the events of the last 2 years, they clearly show that in many societies around the world, the lessons of the Second World War, Cold War, they have not been really much internalized and appropriated, and perhaps also not communicated by historians to wider audiences in more digestible format. One book that I had a relation to in the past was a translation of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, Ukrainian into Ukrainian, and one of the bright images that struck me in April, I think, 2022, was a photo of this book that one journalist found in her house in the suburbs of Kyiv, and this was this book translation of Eichmann in Jerusalem into Ukrainian with a page torn out of it, and the journalist made the case that it was a Russian soldier who was stationed in her house who just tried to rip some pages of that book out of that book. Which in a way was very symbolical to me, because many things that Hannah Arendt wrote in Eichmann in Jerusalem, they actually took place on the territory of Ukraine during this first year of invasion of Russian occupation of Ukraine. So these kind of books that we as historians can produce, not just this one, but for example, Christopher Browning's The Reserve Battalion, Police Battalion 101, about participation of normal Germans in the Holocaust and so on and so forth. I think if we were to appropriate them more, to read more of them, it would ease our understanding of the contemporary situation as well. Therefore, again, to sum up, I'd say that historians can play, they are an important part of the society. We are political, inevitably, willingly, nillingly, and we can be important, at least in these two respects. First of all, we can engage with these political manipulations of the past by the politicians, and secondly, we can still find many lessons in the past that can be important for the future.
Yeah, of course, as historians, we think that we can teach and educate people by studying the past and kind of showing that what has happened before and what we can perhaps expect in the future. However, I don't believe that history repeats itself. I think that there can be sort of similar issues, and definitely I hope, as a humanist, of course, I hope that we can learn something from history. But it seems to be so that we don't, but that's another story. So actually I would like to go back to, so we have still about half an hour left, and of course we want to leave time for questions from the audience, but actually I would like to go back to library. And of course if we can go back to Slavonic Library or Slavica, it would be great. And so how you see, because this is connected to earlier question about digitalization, e-materials, even artificial intelligence. Two questions connected. How you see the future of libraries as a whole, and how you see, for example, Slavica in the future, that how can actually Slavica can help you in the future to do your research. So this is sort of a combined question.
Well, they might be two different questions, mightn't they, really? One, of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but anybody can see that the pace of technological change is quite astonishing, isn't it? And it's getting faster, and this must affect the way libraries operate, and so that rooms like this will increasingly seem museum-like rather than useful. On the other hand, I think this goes back to sort of different ways of reading, isn't it? It is very different. Some future historian of reading will write about this, that to read electronic texts is quite different a practice from reading. It's not just a preference, it's a different sort of practice. I brought up very close against this a few years ago when I first did a big research assessment exercise in Britain, and everything was supplied electronically, and you were reading article after article after article electronically. Completely different sort of experience. And I think one of the things I value most about Slavica is the opportunity, as I said earlier, to flit from journal to journal, sometimes things you didn't know were there before. You know, you're not following a bibliography or anything. You just come across a chance reference. You can immediately nip along the shelf to some journal you'd never heard of, look it up, find it, it gives you another reference, and then you follow it through, and you flip backwards and forwards through these things, seeing what else is there. Now, with the electronic reading, you tend to go directly to what you think you already know, and follow that. Whereas the old pattern of reading, I think there was a greater degree of discovery, or at least for me, there's a greater possibility of discovery. And I hope that it will be possible to preserve that here in Slavica, if nowhere else in the world.
Historians do not predict future, that's true. Mm-hmm. And I can only tentatively think of it based on my current plans for the next couple of years. I definitely do not belong to those colleagues whom they call in English as doom merchants, and who talk about the crisis of relevance of libraries in contemporary world, both to scholars and lay readers alike. I still find research library to be a useful place for slow thinking, thinking which is being created by a possibility to engage into slow reading, and which we are privileged of having here in Slavica. So that would be the first point. Libraries still give us a chance to read and think about what we read. But then second part of it would be our opportunity to talk to you, to librarians who know collections much more than we do, and who can point our attention to very often sources we would never be able to find out about without the help of librarians. And then also the third part of answering this question would be that libraries and Slavica, they still provide us a chance to bump onto our fellow colleagues, researchers of different ages, career stages, institutional background, national affiliation, and so on. And perhaps have a coffee with them. One might even have a fortune to come to Slavica one day and meet Simon Dixon, for example, and share some mutual enthusiasm about the history of animals in the Roman Empire with him. I personally still cherish the acquaintance that I made here with colleagues from Japan. It was 10 years ago, but we're still in touch, and it was really great to meet them here. But then coming back to this, again, more personal reflection of why Slavica was important for me and will be important for me if it stays as it is at the moment, is something that Simon already mentioned, is this important peculiarity of Slavica of providing us with open access to periodicals and books, with open shelves. There is a nice quote from one of my favorite historical novels written by Alexander Chudakov. The name of the novel is «Ложится мгла на старые ступени». And the main protagonist of the novel is a historian with a nice name, Anton. And at some point, Anton realizes or is being told that at the University of Michigan, you can walk freely along bookshelves and even take books out of those bookshelves. And when Anton realizes that, he cannot sleep for the next three nights. So this is exactly was my story, actually. I brought up in Kyiv, and in Kyiv, very similarly actually to Petersburg and Moscow later on. Yes, you can see books on shelves, but usually they are being accompanied with a very visible warning, do not touch. And that's why when the first time I encountered an open access library at my university in Budapest, well, I did sleep for the next nights, but I was really, really happy. And even more so when I came to Slavica and saw this gorgeous collection of periodicals where you can just walk around and yes, take them out of shelves and even open them. Of course, putting them back or putting at least a mark that you took the book out of the shelf. And you will be not reprimanded by the librarians for doing that, importantly. So since then, I find this possibility of freely browsing random books that I never knew about as one of the most important inspirations in my scholarly life. Perhaps in some future IT people will be able to recreate this kind of feeling, maybe by creating some kind of virtual libraries, but at the moment I do not see this. On the other hand, what we do have at the moment is this recommendation which is being given to you by electronic library based on your browsing history or based on your history of your purchases. But this is precisely what I do not want to have from open shelves, because what I do want from open shelves is to find something I never thought about and I never knew about, in order not to be turned into this predictable robot who is guided by some algorithms.
Yeah, I can really recognize this because whenever I go to Slavonic Library and I see those wonderful periodicals, I'm thinking that why I started to do this, why I didn't choose all these interesting topics I can find from here, and especially the older, what I called older history, let's say Russian Empire history. I'm doing current contemporary history. So I think that we are sort of heading to the end of our dialogue to give some time for questions from the audience. But before we go there, I would like to ask that what about our speakers or researchers? Is there something in your mind you want to raise at this point that we didn't, discuss about, or is there something that you want to point out before we go?
Not for me. I'm very happy to move to a wider discussion. That would be great.
Okay. This is very non-academic way to define things, but at least those who lived in experience of 1990s, we used to have, especially when we go to Russia or somewhere, we called Big Mac Index. We were looking at how expensive something is. And now I think about this is connected to books, surprisingly. I think I would call it an IKEA index. And so it was quite a long time that there were no books. If you went to IKEA, in this, they are presenting these different rooms, there were no bookshelves. If you go there now, every room has a bookshelf. And I think that that's a good direction, because I love books. Okay, now there is a possibility for audience to ask questions. So I'm moderating. And I'm trying to see, please, as Irma was mentioning, so if you have a question, so tell who you are, ask question, try to be precise, and well, we do have time, but if there are many questions, so floor is open for questions, comments. It's a wonderful opportunity to ask questions of these two remarkable researchers.
Thank you very much. My name is Tomi Huttunen. I'm professor of Russian literature here at the University of Helsinki. Thank you for the fascinating discussion and lots of ideas very much related to things that we're doing also currently. and working here at Slavica. One issue I would like to emphasize on the basis of your discussion, especially what Anton Kotenko, what you said about the need for research of the more peripheral issues and more marginal thematics in studying the previous Russian Empire. What comes to mind is what we're doing currently at the department is the research of Finnish, Ukrainian literary and cultural contacts and their study and using as a Slavica material. The only possibility to do this or to find, for example, the materials from the 19th century or the mid to the 19th century is to go to St. Petersburg journals, and there you have the discussion. You have the discussion between Finnish literature and discussion between Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian writers and Finnish writers participating, or Finnish writers reading the journals and commenting upon this material. I think that it simply illustrates the need to use the also the not only but also access to the materials.
Shall we go through this question, or is there some what do you prefer? Shall we take more questions? So more questions, so we can collect a little bit more questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Pia Koivunen. I'm a senior lecturer in European World History at the University of Turku. And thank you for a fascinating discussion. I can relate to many points as well. I have a kind of a practical and at the same time perhaps a little bit philosophical question I've been struggling with. I'm the president of the Finnish Association for Russian and East European Studies, and now that there is this need to rethink the role of Russia and the Soviet Union in area studies, what do you think, how should we call this area now? And do we even need like one definition or one word for it? But I've been struggling because, I mean, should there be Russia in the name of it or not, and how to call the area? Thank you.
Okay, I think if we go to, so if you have a little more time to think about the area, the new name, so we can go to Tomi's question.
Well, that was more of a comment, but I'm super happy that you are doing this. I think that the first time I gave a talk on the subject on Finnish-Ukrainian entangled history of the 19th century was maybe 6 years ago. Since then, as far as I know, one article has been published whose authors touch upon Irish-Ukrainian, Finnish-Ukrainian and relations, but it's not very deep. Last year, 2 years ago, a volume was produced after a conference in Kyiv on Ukrainian-Irish entangled history. The volume that I'm not a big fan of, let's say, and yes, but overall, the tendency and the intention of this project of yours is just fascinating. I mean, fascinating is a kind of devalued word in a way, but yes, these connections, they've been completely overlooked in the past, and if you are able to unearth them, it would be great.
Well, absolutely. I'm not sure they have been overlooked, really. I mean, in 18th century studies, for example, there's quite a lot of this, always has been, quite a lot of interest in all sorts of connections internationally. So the more, the better on that front, certainly. The more the better, of course, is difficult for your title, isn't it? Because then it's very difficult to know what to call anything. So I don't suppose you'll really finish up with a university satisfactory title, will you? The Americans tried it and finished up with something longer than they can get on the postcard, you know. So it's hard. I'd stick to what you've got.
You want to comment this to Newton?
On the name?
Yeah.
No, but luckily I don't have to face this problem, so I never really thought about it. But as a historian who studies geographical concepts, in a way, I completely understand it and agree with that it's an important issue. Recently, a colleague published a great book on the history of concept of Latin America, and showing the political nature of the concept and its completely non-neutral nature, let's say. So it's good when we think about it and when we reflect on these categories that we use as categories of seemingly objective analysis. Well, from history of my reading of similar stories, the most geographical terms are the most neutral ones. So I guess Eastern Europe would be the concept that I would personally use. But yeah.
Yeah, I think this is one of the questions of this because I have seen during my career that it was East Europe, Russia was Russia, but it was East Europe, then it turned to Eastern Europe, and it was quite important. Now we are discussing about whether it should be Eurasia and that kind of things. But I do understand your pain in this sense. Yeah.
I can only add that one concept that recently I grappled with is the concept of Russian Empire. And why it seemed, I'd be curious to know actually Simon's point on that, because in 1992 Andreas Kapler wrote his book about Russia as a multi-ethnic state. And the book was in a way revolutionary because he pointed out that the empire was populated not just by Russian, but many other ethnic groups. And then historians also kind of embraced this idea, and they started to stress heterogeneity, various heterogeneity, including ethnic heterogeneity of the state. However, they never really changed the name of this polity, and it's still Russian Empire, which is completely understandable. It's an official name of the state, so why shall we change it? However, it's interestingly when you look around it, you will find sometimes really strange sentences in scholarship when historians will write about Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, bordering Russian Empire. So for some reason we are quite keen on introducing the name of a dynasty, of a ruling dynasty, to call Austrian-Hungarian Empire. We don't, well, still, but Habsburg Empire is much more popular among scholars these days. Ottoman Empire has been popular among, if you check Google Ngram again here, it has been popular since the 19th century actually. When you type Romanov Empire in Google Ngram, it's next to zero basically. It has always been Russian Empire. And I think it's quite a problem, even though the state was called Russian Empire, we as historians do not have to follow the language of actors themselves. We can still introduce some analytical categories. And therefore to me it's really just only logical to call it Romanov Empire, to stress that not just Russians lived in that state, and pay attention to experience of those people.
Thank you for the answers. Perhaps more questions?
Thank you. Simo Mikkonen, professor from the University of Eastern Finland, and I have a question related to languages. You already, talked about the influence of languages on studying, but I do teach quite a lot of especially Soviet history, but more generally, Eastern European history as well. And I have a whole lot of students who are interested in the subject and would like to do research on it. But when I've been following the field for 20 years or more, the proficiency of knowing foreign languages other than English has been decreasing. And I was wondering, this is of course, there are many reasons for this, and some are in the Finnish politics, some in the emphasis on natural sciences and so on. But I was wondering, about do you have any thoughts about this and what we could do differently, in order to get students interested in foreign languages? Because I think that's the key to studying, whether it's Russian or East European or Soviet or the collections here. So what could we do differently, or if you have any observations from your own country's universities, so on. Thank you.
Shall I say something in response to
yes,
that?
or should we collect some? There's another question there.
Sorry.
Catherine Gibson from the University of Tartu. Thank you both for these really interesting kind of reflections on how you use the past collections of the library. But I was curious to hear your opinion about future acquisitions. And as kind of users and researchers in the libraries, what kind of things would you like to see kind of prioritized looking forward? Because lots of libraries are facing these kind of financial constraints, limited budgets, and have to make tough choices. So I'd be curious just to hear your opinions on that. Thank you.
I think we go these two questions so we can collect more.
Well, shall I just say something about the languages and then maybe you say something about the future acquisitions? Because you're the future in this discussion. The language, well, who am I to speak about this really? Look, here, I've fortunately been allowed to speak my own language this morning to you all. As some of you know, it's a miserable experience hearing me in any other language. So I'm not one to speak about this. But Britain is terrible, of course. It's really, the modern languages now are sinking at school level quite considerably. I mean, I was lucky that I grew up in this sense during the Cold War, and Russian was taught very widely in schools then. And so I learned what little I know at that stage. And also French and some Latin, but now it's German has virtually disappeared from the school curriculum. There's some French, some Spanish, some Italian, but the modern languages are in difficulty, I think, in Britain. So what you're asking for is to turn a huge kind of tide, and King Canute is not a very attractive part to play, as the waves flow over you. I think that is really difficult. What has to be done, I think, is to provide some sort of language tuition at immediate postgraduate level for those who want to go on to learn a language quickly in a year. And that can be done. It always has been done. And we're not always as good at making provision for that as we should be. Because certainly my own research students, on the whole, have been people who have either been very good at history or very good at Russian, and relatively few of them have been able to do both. And of course, it makes a huge difference to what they can manage if they start with fluency in Russian.
Luckily, I'm not an administrator, and I can't find an answer to this question, but I can just share my experience, and my experience is actually very positive, unlike maybe yours. In the field of history of Ukraine, I do know at least a couple of brilliant scholars from Germany and Switzerland who speak just flawless Ukrainian and who are able to do really, really great research. They are PhD students, of course, so maybe that explains why. But nevertheless, I was super surprised and super happy that finally young scholars are mastering languages in completely unbelievable fashion still 10 years ago. And here maybe digitization helps a lot, because as far as I see, many colleagues are able to take online classes and learn languages. Yes, learning Ukrainian, basically speaking to someone who is in Ukraine, or learning some other language, talking to someone online in Tashkent, let's say. So here I still hope that technology can provide us with new ways of mastering these languages previously unavailable. And as for the acquisitions, yes, maybe I hope and I wish it will be a bit easier in the future in case libraries create more connections between them and create more webs between them. So 10 years ago, when I came here for the first time, I'm not sure there was much communication and connection between Finnish National Library and National Library of Ukraine. And it seems to me that the situation finally changes over the last years. And I hope it will make easier for actually both libraries to exchange ideas of new books, to make it easier for libraries to purchase books from Ukraine and so on. So again, more intensified communication between libraries of the region will make it easier, hopefully.
Okay, time is flying, and I think that I presume that there is no questions in online, and so there is like a time for 1 to 2 questions. So
you were very kind to introduce the term of Ukrainian space, which you started working with in, I guess if I remember correctly, 2010, 2011, is that correct? And
please, can I ask you now to go to your question, because
I am coming to my question, madam, and I'm trying to do it as fast as possible, and I hope that I can reach there.
There is one question waiting, and we need to answer as well. Please go ahead.
Yes, but my question is very important, very relevant, and very sensible, and very unusual for a university in the motherland of Jari Aarnio. So maybe you will learn something. Then you said that in time you learned that your approach had been wrong, and you had to change your question from the question of a Ukrainian space to the very concept of Ukrainian. Is that correct?
No.
I see. Could you please re-clarify that point? Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, thank you. And then there was another question, so we maybe take one question and... Okay, so you can answer as a question, and I think that this is the last question we have.
Okay, so thank you very much, sir. But it's easy to answer your question, because I hope that in 2 years' time the book will be published and you'll be able to read the book and find out the answer to your question. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, I think so. We are reaching to time for lunch break. So I definitely want to thank you for our wonderful panelists, or researchers, not really panel, this was dialogue or trialogue in a way. And so we give a big hand for them. And I also want to thank you, the audience, and very interesting and good questions. So thank you.